Allison, thanks to you, and just a huge thank you to Peter and the entire wonderful team and incredible group of colleagues at ASA for all the work that you do each and every day throughout the year. And it's a real pleasure for me and for the team at AARP Foundation and across AARP to return for this wonderful conference. I hope you all have been enjoying. I know that I have been enjoying the virtual platform, and as always, the rich range of subjects and topics that we're addressing throughout the conference. I'm happy today to be able to launch and moderate a very important conversation on building economic opportunity for moderate and low-income older adults, and doing so with a keen focus on building equitable pathways to financial stability and economic opportunity. As many of you know, at AARP Foundation, we're working for a future without senior poverty. And we are keenly focused on increasing income for low-income older adults, and at the same time, increasing equitable outcomes for those who face systemic racism and discrimination. And so I'm looking forward to hearing from and learning from our panelists today, as well as hearing from the audience and our colleagues and the many questions that you might have to add. We know that this past year, we've seen the convergence of three pandemics: the pandemic of COVID-19, an economic downturn, and the ongoing long-term, well-established pandemic of systemic racism and discrimination. And all of this has hit older adults hard, whether that is the outcome of illness from COVID, the ravaging of communities and color with the COVID pandemic, or job loss. We certainly know that older workers have lost their jobs, their positions, in greater numbers. We also know that for Black and Latinx workers and communities, the loss has been even greater. And then when we think about intersectionality, for women, it has been toughest, and for African American, Black, and Latinx women as well. So when we think about building equitable pathways, it's important for us to be thinking about this in terms of identities and the intersectionality of identities. We're gonna have a wonderful conversation today, and I wanna introduce very briefly the three experts who are joining me on the virtual stage today. Happy to introduce a longtime colleague and friend, Dr. Adrienne Hagelbrook, who is the Executive Vice President and Managing Director for the Social Impact Collective at Southern New Hampshire University, where he provides executive leadership and strategic guidance in advancing SNHU's equity and social mobility agendas by leveraging existing offerings and by promoting and guiding and leading an incredible range of new innovations to learners who truly are learning around the globe. Adrienne has committed an over 3-decade career to influencing access, equity, and opportunity by pushing the conversation and by leading strategy, growth, policies, and also change. It's my delight, Adrienne, to have you join us today, and we want everyone to know that I have the great pleasure also of serving on the SNHU board. I am delighted to introduce and welcome to this conversation a colleague, a co-leader at AARP Foundation. And I have the pleasure, the absolute pleasure, of learning from Emily Allen each and every day. Emily is the Senior Vice President for Programs at AARP Foundation, and her leadership, her sense of strategy, and her guidance are all about the engine of our work. Across her career, Emily has worked in education and economic mobility, directly as a leader in direct service in-person workforce programs. And we're just thrilled, Emily, to have you on the panel today. And finally, what a treat to welcome a colleague and a friend. We had a chance to meet through our Nation Swell connections, but Emily, Adrienne, and I are delighted to be joined by Dr. Prasad Ram, who started Guru while working at Google to develop a GPS for education and skills, where students seeking to learn a topic are presented with a learning route based on their profile and rerouted to additional opportunities based on their performance until they reach their destination. In 2011, Pram established Guru as a nonprofit to bring the simplicity and universal usefulness of Google Map-like experiences to learning. Well, at Google, Pram led Google Books for Education in Mountain View, and before that, he was the head of Google Research and Development in India, where he led projects on Google Maps, news, language technologies, and much more. So you can all see we're going to have a wonderful conversation with these leaders today. So Pram and Adrian and Emily, let's just jump right into it. I want to start talking about our conversations on equity by talking also about age discrimination and a report in 2019, a study that was produced by my colleagues at AARP. And that study found that age discrimination cost the US economy in 2018 $850 billion. So it is both the right thing to do to increase equitable pathways and the right thing to do to have age as a lens of identity, and yet we continue to suffer from inequities and age discrimination is alive and well. So Pram, I want to start with you. Talk to me a bit about your thoughts around what we need to do to include older people as we're innovating and creating equitable pathways, or maybe the flip of that is, what do we lose when we exclude older adults from the conversation?
Yeah. Thank you very much, Lisa, for the wonderful introduction, and good afternoon, everybody. I'm kind of, always struck by how we, these are extremely complex problems. The challenges of addressing equity is not something that we are coming up with it today. We have tried to deal with it in other contexts for centuries, and we have not able to tackle that meaningfully. So I kind of want to always take this, as an engineer and a scientist, I kind of want to place the reality check, saying let's not kind of be wishful, but let's actually be extremely elegant about how we go about it, right? And the aspect of, when you think about Google Maps, you don't think about equity as the starting point. That's not the first thought that comes to your mind, but it was very, very fundamentally designed with that in view, saying whether you're 10 miles from the airport or 100 miles from the airport, one is not smarter than the other, right? You'll get everybody to their destination, whether you take public transport or you want walking directions, whether you want to take trains in Tokyo or drive in Detroit, nothing matters, right? It's about who you are, where you are, and what is your destination and get you there. Now, that is kind of the elegance we need to bring for this to become universal. Otherwise, it's a huge contraption. We can run many programs and initiatives, and it will just not reach the number of people. We have 7 billion people here, and we need to kind of address that in a very elegant way, like we did with a lot of the other web products.
Yeah, Pram, thank you. I think you've started us off on a really important note, which is thinking about the elegance of the design, but also being keenly focused on designing to get the results that you intend to get. Because I hear in your comments that from the start, the design is everyone gets there, whatever the route is. And we have been designed, we shouldn't be surprised by the inequity we have today, given the design that we've had as well. So thank you, Pram. Adrian, jump in and talk about equity building and access to equitable opportunities in your work and career.
Right. I have to agree so much with what was just said. We're talking about systemic and structural issues that have been a part of the sort of the fabric of at least this country and actually globally. And so we are dealing with some real complex issues. I think of it from a couple of different perspectives. One, a very personal one, and then one along the lines of the structural systemic. I have a coffee talk with my mom and dad every Monday morning, including just this morning. My mother and father are retired 2006, 2007. My father will turn 80 in just a couple of weeks. My mother's 76, will be 77 this year. And I think of my father's pathway of growing up in the Deep South. And at the time that he finished high school, there were, a couple of pathways that he could have taken. One was, go on to a post-secondary experience. And we all know during that time, that wasn't a guarantee. The other was military. And so he did about a semester in college and then off to the military for a career. And the military provided him and our family a venue to really sort of turn that switch on that one generation notion that within one generation you can change lives. But what I learned through my father's experience was it was through education. So after he retired from the military of 20 years, he used his GI Bill and went back to college and graduated 1 year before I graduated from college. And so when I think about that example, so that's the personal example. And when I link that up to the structural systemic kinds of issues, three things that I'm really anxious to see or that I would devote my time to. One is thinking about this notion or this fact that Americans are living longer. And yes, there are racial disparities and gender disparities when we look at that, but people are living longer, which means one of two things. Either folks are in retirement longer, or you're working longer. And working could be by choice or by force because of the economic disparities that we have. The second thing that really drives my work is really thinking about those disparities. And when you follow along those racial lines and particularly gender lines as it relates to economics, if we're living potentially longer, then that means the complications due to health, due to our finances and all other things become exacerbated. And so are we actually tipping the scale on creating an even wider gap? And then the third thing is I think there's a lot of place and space for public policy. And so this will be interesting to see how we really bring the context of the older American into this view of public policy.
Excellent, Adrian. You've added on Pram's great opening many threads for the conversation that we'll have over the course of the next several minutes. And I might say it doesn't surprise me, but I am delighted to know that you have a Monday coffee talk with your parents each and every week. It's important, and I bet you've been doing it via phone or maybe using virtual tools. We could talk about that a bit later too. Getting them on FaceTime or Teams
True.
or Zoom as well. Emily, I'd love for you to jump in and also maybe extend your opening comments, Emily, to talk about the specific experience you have in identifying the barriers that low-income older adults have to obtaining the skills and knowledge they need to, as Adrian said, remain at work, because we know that we have a growing number of older adults who have lost their jobs, but we have well over 13 million older adults who pre-pandemic were working full-time and still didn't have enough resources to secure their essentials.
Yeah, well, thank you, Lisa, and it's so great to be part of the panel for sure. I mean, what a great discussion and such a continuing important topic. It's interesting, you had mentioned as in my introduction that I have a long history. I've been with the AARP enterprise 26 years and very much started at the community level with one of our programs that we continue to run, the Senior Community Service Employment Program. As a project director, running that program locally in Florida. And you asked the question about what do we lose when we experience things like age discrimination. And I got to see firsthand, and that was really a huge introduction to the remainder of my career around the marginalization of older adults in this nation. And I got to see firsthand how people who had contributed a lifetime across a variety of sectors were suddenly found themselves at the age of 55 or 60 completely marginalized, not valued for the experience that they brought to the table, struggling to get in front of employers or even get that foot in the door, that proverbial foot in the door. And so, I had the good fortune to start that way because I've really carried that experience of what happens day to day in community with me throughout my career as I've really worked with AARP Foundation and my team and the team across the foundation to really think of what are those solutions that we need to begin to put into place. And yes, there are individual solutions that need to happen, but there's also, to Adrian's point, the systemic solutions that need to occur. And so we need to make sure that we're looking at the entire ecosystem that surrounds older adults and not just look at them. One, I think too often we think about older adults as kind of this one giant big monolith and they've all had the same experiences, but that's not the reality. You know, every person is different. Every experience that they've had and they bring to the table is different. And I used to say, you know, it's funny, when I worked directly with individuals, you know, older adult women who were perhaps had not worked outside the home and were having to return to the workforce as a result of death or divorce. And quite frankly, they had similar characteristics to a younger person entering the workforce for the first time. But because they were of a certain age, people assumed different things about them. So, you know, I think that's one thing that we've really tried to do in our programs is really identify not just what we need to do at an individual level, but how do we work with the various players in community and nationally, whether that's employers, whether that's training institutes like community colleges, whether that's, you know, workforce investment boards, to make sure that we're all working together to put into place the programs, the systems, and the structure that's needed to really support older adults as they continue in their pathway.
Yeah, thank you, Emily. I'd love for Pram and Adrian and Emily, let's stay on this conversation for a minute, because we're talking about the systems work. So how do you, what's on my mind, and I would love for the three of you to jump in, is how do you build, you know, evidence-based, scalable opportunities for low-income older adults as we're building equitable pathways, and do that while at the same time we're addressing systemic problems and continuing to focus on equity and for low-income older adults. So it all could be lost in the dialogue. So I don't know, Pram, Adrian, jump in there. Go ahead, Pram.
Adrian is on mute still. Again, I'll kind of go back to my point about elegance. This is an extremely complex problem. As Emily just pointed out, there's just so many actors in the space and so many things need to come together. And we have not solved it for hundreds of years, right? So the question for me always is, so what is the elegant way of tackling this problem so that in this, you know, people who are looking for opportunities now can be supported, as opposed to some program that we put in place that happens well after we are gone in the best case scenario. So to me, there are three elements to this. One is you have to tap into the collective intelligence of the entire ecosystem. We cannot kind of do it through a surgical fix. We are going to kind of fix this piece and then fix that piece. And, you know, it's like kind of changing somebody through a series of surgeries. You'll create a Frankenstein, right? But you have to do it through a very elegant genetic tweak, right?
Yes.
And I keep coming back to my Google Maps example, right? Can we build something that's actually, if you think about your experience with Google Maps, all it is really a data backbone, right? It does not build roads. It does not build Starbucks, does not do toll booths, does not do any of these parks or anything else. All it does is provides an incredibly elegant data backbone. So anything can come up in any community and it will provide you the navigation, whether it's public transport or walking directions. Now that is kind of how, at least I think about it, as let's kind of tap into the collective intelligence of the world. Let's engage, let's develop a very clear learning data backbone. And finally, let's engage the researchers and scientists who actually know how learning happens so that you can, you know, be more qualified for another job. So I'll just end by saying this one thing, which is all of learning, all of workforce, everything focuses on the destination. Again, to use my Google Maps model. We talk about where we want you to be. We just don't know where you are. And to me, equity starts with understanding. It starts with understanding everybody where they are first, right? Yes. And if you're talking about a 50-year-old person, 50-year-old people are not like in 50th grade, right? If you put them in a class, right? So everybody is in a very, very different place. And you need to first understand where they are so that you can take them to their destination.
Yeah,
So,
Fran, that's so, as always, such a very clear way. I am not an engineer, but you have such a gift to bring us all onto the same page, which is, I hear you saying, how do we leverage the best of the infrastructure in its broadest definition that already exists, and to create pathways, whether I want to take a scenic route or whether I want a fast route. But how do we open up the access and the best of diversity and inclusion work, but with the keenest focus on the opportunity for the same or equitable outcome? Adrian, I want to hop to you because I've heard you speak about the time and learning continuum. And if you would jump in here, it would be really helpful as well.
Yeah, I really love that 50th grade analogy.
I
I will
do.
take that with me. There's a plus and a delta with that, but I love that. When I think of this work, and I think of kind of three elements of it that really kind of provide that infrastructure, that architecture for this kind of innovation to live. There's the foresight. And so when I think about the work that SNHU is doing now, is not what we just came up with. It was the foresight started in 1995, and even before then. So when you begin to envision, what will the future look like, and realizing that the future is already sending us signals and indicators. So it's not, okay, what can we do for 1995? It's not, what can we do for 2021? But as we begin thinking about what is 2030, what is 2040, that's when you can begin to envision and really add texture to the kind of diversity that we're talking about. When you realize that that we have demographic shifts based on racial and ethnic lines, looking at gender equity and inequities, looking at geographic diversity, thinking of all of those, and then adding the dimensionality of age and really understanding what that means. And so that's that kind of foresight piece to really draw towards. The second arm of this is, having the programmatic elements that you can look at and understand. How do you build efficiencies in this process that allows it to be modularized that could lead to replication and scale? And so when what you were talking about, Lisa, was SNHU had this idea and thinking about innovation where the traditional post-secondary experience, if those of us who have had the opportunity to obtain that experience, we realize that it's often qualified by what we say butts in seats. You go there, you have to spend a certain amount of time to earn that credit. You have to accumulate so many credits in order to graduate to receive that credential. And so a lot of that is really built around how the institution designs the experience. But some of us are really looking at this in a very different way. Instead of looking at how does the institution design the experience that we have to come to, we're now looking at this as how do you build the experience with the learner at the center? This is the design model that you just heard. How do you design this with the learner at the center? And then all of those other trends that I just talked about become influencers in how do you design that process? How do you design that learning so that it really is learner-centric, that it allows for the pathways, it allows for the different flexibility that's needed so that I could be here in Manchester, New Hampshire, Washington, D.C., or Seattle, Washington, and I can still tap into my coursework. I can still tap into the experience. And then understanding what the needs are by the demographic, you begin to understand the types of services that really help support that learner through his or her or their journey. And so now you're really talking about innovation. Now you're talking about that roadmap that really allows for me to curate that experience because I have these tools available for me. And oh, by the way, you do it at an affordable pricing model. And so again, really thinking about how do you create the kind of access with the magnitude and scale and replication that really drives self-direction and really drives experience for lifelong learning.
Yeah, thank you, Adrian. And I couldn't agree more with you and with Pram about this and about the fact that, learning's a lifetime experience. You don't learn or get one credential or one degree and have everything that you need to know for the possibility or the richness of opportunity across a life course. Of course, we're talking about a population that has not had that same richness of opportunity in every case. But we're also speaking about how we, in an elegant way, as Pram would say, can build out pathways so that more people can get on those roads. Emily, what do you see in terms of the world of upskilling or reskilling, credentialing? What are we learning from vulnerable and low-income older adults, especially those who are left most behind in the workforce, about what they need?
Yeah, no, really good question, and I really want to build on what Adrian was saying about making sure that you are being very person-centric. And I will give a shout out to you, Lisa, for really bringing human-centered design to our work as we think about creating new solutions. And and I'll use a quote that I know you like to use, is we were often guilty of building a really cool solution and then going out and trying to find a problem for it to solve, right? And all good intentions, all very good intentions, but you can fall in love with a solution that sounds good on paper, but quite frankly, doesn't really meet the needs of anybody, particularly the people that you're trying to help. And so we really flipped everything on its head several years ago as we began to look at how do we build new solutions. And it was absolutely gathering those critical customer insights and consumer insights from low-income older adults. And so really going out and having the dialogue and the discussions, not just about others who were trying to support individuals, because that's often what happens. We all, we experts all get in a room and decide what the solution should be. We really took it to heart to go out in community, have the discussions that are needed, test some things, put out a basic, a minimum viable product, if you will, or a program, and then get the feedback. Is this meeting your needs? Is it not? A really good example, I would say, is, as we started building on our history of operating, workforce and training programs, as we looked at building a program that we now operate called Back to Work 50 Plus, and then also Work for Yourself 50 Plus, recognizing that older adults were very much interested in self-employment or entrepreneurship or the gig economy. We really needed to hear firsthand what were the resources that they needed. And one of the biggest insights we had, and it sounds obvious now, quite frankly, but one of the biggest insights as we were starting Back to Work 50 Plus is the whole idea that, it sounded great to think about training and getting older adults, more connected with educational opportunities, but older adults have complicated lives and they have busy lives. So really looking at ways in which we could look at things like micro-credentialing and make sure we were building on the experience that they had, but not expecting someone to take 2 years to get a degree in order to get a job and get that return on that investment. And so that was a real eye-opener of how do we go about working with different organizations, different training providers, so that we were really looking at how do we look at competencies that are needed versus degrees and what has traditionally been that way. And I think it builds on what Adrian was talking about, of really looking differently about how skills are provided and education is delivered across the lifespan.
Great, thanks so much, Emily. You're right. And I was smiling as you were talking. I remember, I appreciate your patience with me when I started at the foundation, and I would wander around a bit and say, is this a solution in search of a problem? So it goes back to what Pram was saying about, you start with the facts. What is the evidence we have, and what do we need to know? Getting back to the equity piece, Pram, can you spend some time talking with us a little bit more about Guru and how you've built this out, and how it can, what do we all need to know about helping learners of all identities, all ages, intersectionality, be able to curate their experience of learning so that they're able to identify the competencies they have and the competencies they need to be in a position to secure work in in-demand jobs?
Yeah, I'll just kind of, before I dive into that, I'll just build on something Adrian said, right? And, our traditional approach has been institutions build the experience and
Right.
replication is scaling, right? But what we know is replication is not scaling. What works for one child of yours does not work for the second child of your own, right? Leave alone replicating it across 50-year-olds who live in different parts of the country and so on and so forth. So this is fundamentally the problem that we have to tackle, that replication is not scaling, but emergence is scaling.
Yes.
Solutions manifest for every individual in their local context based on who they are, based on the opportunity in that community, based on the support infrastructure that they are able to garner, so that the solution manifests for them. So emergence is scaling. We call it emergence in the complexity science, right? Saying things emerge in every local context. Replication is not scaling, but this is kind of how we are trained to think, saying institutions build the experience and now this one size will fit all, right? I have a class of, some graders here, right? And so Guru's approach, again, if you deeply think about your experience with Google Maps, everybody is in some locality. You can't tell, right? And I often get lost in my own locality, in my own gullies. If I hit the freeway, then I know how to make it to the airport. But most often I'm just, circling around in my own neighborhood, right? So if you can precisely locate every learner, and when I say locate, I mean locate them for their knowledge, locate them for their mindsets, locate them for their
Who they are.
who they are as a person, right? You have to understand. See, that is the source of equity, is understanding somebody, not characterizing them by a few labels about their
Right.
gender or race or age or whatever, but actually understanding them with high precision. See, Google
Yes.
Maps works because everybody is located on a latitude and longitude with high precision. So when you are journeying, if you make a wrong turn or take a wrong exit, there's no harm. This is, as long as the blue arrow turns that way, it's going to reroute you back to the airport, right? So there's no anxiety during the journey. And that's kind of the approach that Guru takes, is let's understand where everybody is in the competency framework across all the different facets of learning. And then as they are kind of, instead of preparing them through a program, like Emily was saying, instead of a 2-year program that you're all sitting through, let's kind of tell, given where you are first, let's tell you what are the opportunities available for you in different areas of, maybe you can be a store clerk at Walmart, maybe you can be a barista at Starbucks. There are many, many opportunities. What are the competencies each of these require? And then we'll give you a personalized pathway that takes you from
it is so, Priyam, when you're talking, big takeaways, right? Let's all repeat it. Replication is not scale. I think, Priyam, that is something important that you're sharing, because there is such a drive to say, okay, it works. I have the evidence that it works in X context. And then to say, I'll just drop that down through a range of partners or in an ability of, range of communities as well. I also am taking away from your comments, Pram, this notion. So this is learning for me, new language. I'm going to commit to know people precisely, the precision of knowing who our learners are, knowing the people we're serving. I think that speaks to not only driving more equitable outcomes or building the pathways, Pram, but it speaks up front to a connection and a commitment to the person and the outcome that you want them to achieve in a really holistic way. In my mind, it's I guess it's radical inclusion. It's that radical co-creation with the individuals that we're serving. So, thank you for that. Adrian and Emily, I want the two of you to jump in, because so much about what we're talking about today is
Yeah.
about continuing to disrupt
Right.
what have been the more traditional or relied upon ways in which we learn and the anchor institutions that provide it, but also so much about what we talk about in terms of workforce development and learning today is about digital literacy and development. And so where are the successes there that we can drive into, but what are some of those barriers that that still
Yeah.
exist around access? Adrian, I can
Yeah.
tell you're jumping in. Good.
I am.
I want
No,
you to.
thank you for this, and this is why you put all of us together, because we're just like bridging from one person's comment to the next.
It
And
is.
I love the point that Pram made about my point about there's replication and then there's scalability. And let me share with you examples of where replication actually helps to drive either better efficiencies or better, knowing, precision of knowing, as well as where and how it could potentially drive scalability. So when we think of one of the biggest problems in the United States relative to post-secondary education, data shows that there are approximately 40 million Americans who have some college credit but no college degree, 2-year or 4-year, 40 million. So if you were to turn that into a demand factor, there's not a single entity in this country that could service 40 million learners. And so when you think about that from the demand aspect of it, then if you have replicable models that actually gain efficiencies, and when I say efficiencies or efficacy, that they're actually turning out results, then what you have is you have a model that you could actually utilize and learn from. You can't necessarily take it as a whole and drop it someplace else, but you can learn from that. And so then you begin to mitigate those demand issues just by replication. But having scale, you have a few institutions in the United States that can actually scale these types of demands. And so, but even with that, it still takes several of those types of entities to actually meet the demand. And so at SNHU, and this gets to a little bit of the question that you're asking of me as well, Lisa, at SNHU, the area that I'm heading up, launching and heading up is the answer to what are those inequities that are still found within our scaled approach?
Right.
Where and how do we service that, learn from that without disrupting or distracting from our core operations? How can we figure out how to define the problem, address the problem, and prove efficiencies and efficacy, and then bring those learnings back into our scaled operations? And so that's where you can find about how do you do this work with older adults? How do you do this with military? How do you do this with refugees? How do you do this with those who were formerly incarcerated? You can't seize that with a scaled approach. You've got to model it through replication and build. And so the big thing around, you're not just moving learning into a Zoom feature,
Right.
because and in fact, we're reframing, much of higher education now is reframing this notion. We used to call it distance learning or online learning. We're now starting to call it digital learning. And what digital learning actually suggests is that you take technology and you match that with instruction to really provide a learner-centric, engaged experience. Why? Because distance learning still puts the institution in the center. Digital learning puts the learner at the center. And so within that digital environment, you have opportunities for synchronous and asynchronous learning. You have that degree of flexibility. The learner can curate his or her or their own experience. They can pace things differently. And this is what that digital learning creates. It creates that environment for enablement and engagement. And so I think we're going to see that. And so, Lisa, you were talking about the conversation that I have with my mom and dad every Monday morning. We do it virtually since haven't been able to travel over the last year. But all of us in some form or fashion have been impacted and affected by the digital economy in ways that we might not even understand. So why shouldn't our post-secondary experience also be of that?
That's right. All of that disruption. And I really appreciate, Adrian, your reminder to all of us as we're having this conversation about building equitable pathways, being focused with the learner at the center, but also understanding that organizations, we have to be organization-centric only in so much as you're saying, Adrian, that we are willing to examine what we're building and what we've built to see where the challenges are toward truly launching equitable frameworks that really optimize opportunity for more learners. Emily, I do want you to jump in because, talk a bit about, you have kept the workforce programs and our learning programs going throughout the convergence of these pandemics. But what I would say is, well before COVID-19, you were building programs that relied upon continually digital literacy and technologies for individuals who often don't have access.
Absolutely, yeah, thank you. And I know I'm having a little bit of audio problems, so I apologize for that. But it's been such a, I feel like just saying ditto to everything that Adrian just talked about. But you're right. I mean, it's throughout my career, as far as looking at education, employment, training programs, how we integrated technology and digital literacy was critical, because we could have built, a program around, pen and paper. But if the reality was, as employers were going much more in the direction of having things more automated or more digital focused, then we knew we had to prepare older adults for integrating into an employer's systems. Everything from even thinking about how timesheets are kept. As we think about, again, that low-income older adult, that frontline worker, we had to model the right things for the older adults and the older workers as they would integrate into an unemployment situation. So it was really incumbent upon us. I remember, like I said, a number of years ago, just as an example, as employers were doing much more applications online. There was this tendency from more, I would say, traditional programs to say, oh, well, I won't work with an employer unless they take, paper applications. Well, that's just not helping prepare the older adult workers for what they will face as they get into employment. So it's incumbent upon those that are supporting individuals to really understand what the world of work looks like right now, and help prepare individuals for, like I said, integrating into that.
Great, thanks, Emily. Pram and Adrian, I want to turn to you, and Emily, certainly jump in on this as well. I want to get back or go a little bit deeper on educational technologies and digital learning. And Pram, I'm so fascinated by Guru and the fact that people could have in their hands a tool that helps them understand where they are in their journey, their learning journey, and where they need to head. How do we, leaning into what Adrian said about the importance of future casting all the time, right? Constantly thinking about what's happening down the road. What would you two share with us about what you're seeing with your own educational technology, about how these tools can be more equitable, more open to learners from a range of identities, including low-income older workers and low-income older workers who are African American, Black, Latinx, identify as LGBTQ, communities who have been left further behind. Pram, would you start?
Yeah, there's a recent book, I forget the author's name. The book is called Failure to Disrupt, and an MIT professor. And the key point is how education technology has failed to disrupt, right? There's always this hope that the radio was going to make education work, that the TV was going to make education work, that the internet was going to make education work, that laptops were going to make education work, or cell phones were going to make education work. And, we keep...
And now it's Zoom. Zoom's going to make it work.
So the point is, and then I'll kind of mention one more thing, that people in the economics field kind of basically the way they set policies was they actually tracked your GDP of a country or a region, and then they designed a policy that was meant for last year, actually, because the GDP just went by, right?
Yeah.
And all the economic activities. They use the term nowcasting. It's a combination of the word now and forecasting, where they're
Right.
saying, let us actually see the economic activities data that's coming in right now to model and project using AI and machine learning and all these wonderful things. Where is the economy now, so that the economic policies can be based on that. Now, that is precisely what we need to do. We need to nowcast the learners. We need to look at all of their learning activity. Like yesterday, I learned about pandemic. Today, I'm learning about racism. Tomorrow about elections, and day after tomorrow about economy. This follows no curriculum sequence anybody has prescribed anywhere else in the world, right? This is my life sequence. So I'm continuously learning, and I'm an adult. I'm continuously learning. I'm picking up a lot of skills. Now, if you are able to nowcast me and understand through a data stream from all of my learning activities, you process the data stream to say, what does Pram know? Right now that you have with precision what Pram knows, then each of the job opportunities, I can say, I can retrain myself to be a flight attendant, given that I have these skills and so on and so forth, or I can retrain myself to be, somebody in somebody in manufacturing or something.
Pram, and then Adrian, I want you to jump in. I want us to also get at this. Every time you talk about the pathways that you're building, it's inspirational to me, because it goes back to the person, again, down to that precision knowing. So often what I've found in the work that we're privileged enough to do with low-income older adults who have real challenges and systemic barriers to economic opportunity is, people haven't asked them, or they haven't built the confidence to be able to share what they know, to know things and have those things valued, their knowledge, and to have their contributions valued as well. But Adrian, jump in on the educational technology dialogue.
Yeah, I would say that the recent technologies that have really risen or emerged have sort of followed these lines. These are technologies, if we go back to the interplay that I had before around time and learning, they're focused around that. Technologies that create lower barriers to entry. And so it's not just about what does it cost, but what are the ways that you mitigate or eliminate how I can actually access education. And then there are technologies that really help to create a variety of modalities. How do you actually, once you access it, then how does it come to you? And then flexibility, as we said before, I could be geographically flexible, I could be time and pace flexible, and then thinking about the portability of that as well. So can I bring it with me wherever I go? And then some of the newer pieces that we're trying to get the fix on is what you're just talking about, Lisa, is what we call prior learning experience. And so when you think of that, you might think prior learning experience has to do with, oh, where did I go to school before?
Right.
No, it's all about how can I get credit for what I have learned based on what I've experienced. So if I've been in the storeroom for 5 years and I've learned how to manage people, then how do I get credit for that? And so prior learning experience is one. And then again, AI and all the other pieces that we often talk about are really helping to bring that personalization in that learner-centric paradigm.
Yeah, I think so important, Adrian, that you remind us of the importance of how we help people define prior learning in much broader ways. It's so important to me in the context of the conversation we're having about building equitable pathways, because the challenges, we're talking about individuals who in many ways have been locked out of opportunity for themselves, in their families generationally, or in their communities. So lowering barriers and confirming the skills, talents, and contributions that they have and can make is so important. Emily, how is this resonating with you in terms of the programs that you're leading, but also you are constantly pivoting, innovating, and designing things wholly new in our programs.
I had to jump in with what Adrian said, because I think that's so true. It's true, but I will say that the role then, or the emphasis then, needs to shift on, and I'm glad you used that example of, you've been working in a storeroom, or, and where we started this conversation is around marginalized individuals, older adults, older workers being extremely marginalized, age discrimination occurring. And so the helping an individual translate their prior learning experience, that is so critically important, having worked directly with, older workers that just feel so beaten down, quite frankly,
That's
and
right.
for years. And so trying to build, what we found in our programs is having the connections and building the confidence is so critically important, so that they're in a position to take advantage of the educational technologies or the learning technologies or whatever. But until they have that confidence and they have the connections in order to be able to do so, it will only take us so far. So that's where it really goes back to the design has to be with individuals, so that we address those really critical components of the kind of the intrinsic feeling people have and anxieties they have, not with engaging with technology, but how do they bring their full selves to the effort.
Great. I'm going to ask participants, you certainly can write to us in chat if you have any specific questions. I've been trying to weave some in, but as we're waiting for those, Emily and Adrian and Pram, I want you to each think about, and if you could share one bold step or strategy that should be taken to build more equitable pathways to economic opportunity, what would it be? And it could be a tool, it could be technology, it could be a policy. One bold strategy, what would you want to share? Who's ready to jump in first?
I'm ready.
I thought so, Adrian. I was trying to sit up in my chair, but I saw you. I know what, you're getting ready. Jump in.
This may feel like an obvious one coming from me, but I'm going to say I think we have some real opportunities, particularly through this new administration, to really mitigate the digital divide, and really thinking about older Americans as part of that. So there's the American Jobs Plan. There's about $100 million committed to help build a broadband infrastructure. And the thing that's key about that is that we know that about 30 million Americans lack access. And a majority of those are in rural areas. And about 42% of those folks are those who are 65 and older.
That's
and
right.
so just imagine what you can do with skills training and all the other things that we've been talking about today. So I think that's something that that's really exciting for me.
Yeah, whether it's obvious or not, it's critical, right? It's the opportunity to have your GPS learning tool in your hand depends upon it, which is great. Thanks, Adrian. Pram.
I would just build on that to say, if every employer who has new opportunities can specify what is the job, what are the competencies required for their job, not what's a degree that you require for your job. When you place a degree requirement, you're automatically discriminating against the 40 million people who don't have a degree, right? If you say, hey, here are the competencies required for the job, then every learner or every individual can locate where they are with respect to their proficiency against these competencies and say, yep, I can train on this on the job, or I can prepare for it by taking a training elsewhere for some of these competencies. And this kind of becomes a universal definition of where the opportunities are and what competencies are required to fulfill those jobs.
Yeah, Pram, isn't that, I mean, such an elegant solution if that bold strategy took root? Because as you were talking, I was thinking, we say we want to increase economic opportunity for all. And we say we want to change these systems that have been built over hundreds of years that have locked out opportunity. Well, Well, our collective willpower means we all have a role to play, is what I hear you reminding us of, Pram. And employers have a role to play, clear up the confusion. I often say in my role, I'm the chief clarity officer. So Pram, that's really what you're saying. Clear up the confusion. Let individuals know what the skills are. It's the only way, especially those with few resources, or as Emily said, complex lives. You're stopping out of work for caregiving. You've lost a job because of age discrimination. All of our complex lives, clarity really is key. Two great solutions. Emily, calling on you next. You're following. These are tough acts to follow here, Emily, for us, I'll tell you.
I would definitely agree with those. I guess what I would say is, you know, and I think it's very much the conversation we're having today, bringing together different voices. I think, you know, having been in this space for a while, you know, there's a tendency for the same groups to be talking about this issue and quite frankly, be responsible for solving it. And we need to make sure that there's different voices in the room. We've already talked about the need for the older adult worker to be that one of those voices, but it's critical that we bring in a variety of voices and a variety of perspectives in order to really make these pathways happen. And too often we tend to have the same conversation over and over again. So I would just, you know, recommend that we really disrupt who's at the table as we think about these solutions.
Yeah, Adrian, jump in on that.
I think that was brilliant, and I think you know, it's quite infrequent that you actually hear higher education as being one of those partners. And so as I think about even the last statement that I made about the American Jobs Plan, it's not just workforce, but if we could this, you know, through this technology, you actually create opportunities for telemedicine, so better quality of life, particularly if I'm working longer, either by force or by choice, access to social services and other types of services, and thinking about the total dimensionality of the person. Now you're talking about, now I have a better scope on who and how different elements need to be at the table.
Yes.
So I fully support you on that. Two hands up, Emily.
Yeah, two hands up to each of you. But you're right, Adrian. You know, Emily is leading with me as we're doing our work, working hard to increase economic opportunity, but doing so with this keen focus to what you're saying of get money in people's pockets and stop it from going out in those areas that are really critical pain points for them. You know, we often think that poverty or people being in difficulty is their fault, is an individual failing, but it isn't. The issues we're talking about today are about a national or societal illness. And I know that I wrap up this conversation with, I'm an optimist. I'm a practical optimist though, but I have restored hope for the power of cross-sector, true strategic partnership, and of expanding not only who's at the table, but being sure that everyone at the table has more power and more authority to help us make the decisions to create the equitable pathway. So before I thank each of you, I'm trying to be sure I stay right on time. I want to give each of you an opportunity for any wrap-up commentaries or requests of the audience, those who are listening now and those who will be listening into the future for this recorded session. Graham?
Yeah, I would say please visit my nonprofit site, www.guru.org, and write to me. We are incredibly committed to supporting lifelong learners worldwide. We work with skills training, we work with US K-12, we work with Silicon Valley engineers and so on. Whoever wants to learn, it's going from point A to point B. And we are a nonprofit organization, and the work we do is entirely free and open. So please reach out to me at guru.org.
Got it. Visit the site, everyone, and reach out to Pram. Adrian.
I would just close by saying, you know, one size does not fit all, but the power of many to solve a problem is exponential.
Fabulous. Emily.
I would just say then change the conversation. We all have the power to change the conversation around the value of older adults in our communities, and to change the conversation about a lifetime of education. It doesn't have to be how it always has been of you go to grade school, you go to high school, you go to college, you get a job, and then you quit learning. And I think it's incumbent upon all of us to really change that dialogue so that people feel the ability and value of going in and out of the education experience.
Great. So I want everyone to join me in just a robust, a really warm thank you to Adrian and Pram and Emily. It has been such a treat to talk with you today. I'm really looking forward for the four of us continuing our work together on building equitable pathways for learning and for economic opportunity. I'm looking forward to our ASA colleagues across all sectors joining us in that work. Have a wonderful afternoon, and thanks again to our experts. Bye all.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thanks, everybody.
Bye.